Welcome everyone to the fourth and final roundtable event in our series, Posthumanism, Cinema, Philosophy, Media. My name is Russ Kilbourne from Wilfrid Laurier University's Department of English and Film Studies. Today's event is titled More Than Human, Posthumanism, Human Technological Relations, and Bioethics. Before proceeding though, I want to begin by stating that this is an official Wilfrid Laurier event, and Laurier is situated in Waterloo, Ontario. So therefore, I want to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University is located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. And I also want to acknowledge that whether we're here in Waterloo or elsewhere in the region, we are always speaking from unceded territory. So with that, I would like to once again welcome all of you joining us from points all over the world, which is always the case with these events, which is amazing. For this panel discussion, focusing on posthumanism, bioethics, and the complex relationships and entanglements between humans and technology. Today we have 4 panelists, including our moderator, from very different academic backgrounds, offering their diverse perspectives on these questions. This event, as I've already noted, was organized by Julia MP, who's a PhD student in the Department of English and Film Studies at Laurier. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Julia, who will get things started. Okay, Julia, thank you.
All right. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. It's almost very fitting that we are still meeting on Zoom and being mediated through technology when we are going to have 3 amazing presentations on various topics and entanglements pertaining to such. But before we do that, I would like to first introduce Jeremy Hunsinger, who is our host today. And Jeremy holds a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Virginia Tech. He is an associate professor in communication studies at Wilfrid Laurier University and a fellow of the Balsillie Institute of International Affairs. He has written many scholarly articles in journals and books. His work primarily engages questions of ethics, politics, knowledge, and technology. He has worked to define the field of internet research with 2 handbooks and is currently working on a handbook on the internet and public policy and a special issue on the issues around academic automation. His most recent articles are titled Technology, Democracy, and Hope, and Toward a Critical Theory of Playful Research in the Internet Age. So that being said, thank you, Jeremy, and I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Julia. Russ, I'm assuming we're all fairly informal here. Yes, I'm Jeremy Hunsinger, and I'm moderating, hosting the panel from my academic background, which is in STS and philosophy before that, and political science to some extent. So today we're starting with Dr. Andrea Austin, an associate professor of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. And she has published on science fiction, video games, and game cultures, narrative theory, and the history of technology, including biomedical technologies as represented in film and fiction. Take it away with the presentation.
Hello, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Julia. I don't know about amazing. It has been a rough term. And this is very much, the talk I'll be giving today is very much a work in progress. I know I don't have all the pieces put together yet. It's still quite patchy, so I will be very grateful for all of your comments. I'll begin by sharing my slides. Okay, and I'm just going to leave it not in slideshow view if everyone can see that all right. I just find it a little bit easier to navigate. So in the last 3 years, I've changed my mind about a lot of things. I know I'm not alone in this. We have just been through a global pandemic in which biomedical technologies have functioned as both a panacea and a club. We are facing existential threats on several fronts to the ideals of human rights and free speech, not to mention the collapse of global supply chains, and the ideal of relatively stable and transparent currencies, as we are bombarded with advertisements for get-rich-quick cryptocurrencies, many of which we also know function as laundromats for organized crime. And we know that many of the youth of industrialized nations where such studies have been conducted are radicalizing to the far right or to the far left. If anything, I think I'm understating the situation. I haven't even mentioned climate change. In the face of all this, what, if anything, do critical theories of posthumanism have to offer us? Do they provide any insights that can help us to understand how we got here, or better yet, how to improve things? How about transhumanism? Is it any different in its apparent project? And if so, is it any more useful? I'll try to approach these questions through the topic of biohacking. Originally, when I began this bit of work for a conference that was canceled a few months into the pandemic, I was actually interested in how biohacking has spread as a popular movement through its savvy use of social media, as well as how its focus on citizen science interrogates distinctions between posthumanism and transhumanism. But this too has changed. Now I'm more interested in, and in fact, I'm more than a little alarmed by how social media itself might function as a type of biohacking, and on a far larger scale than the biohacking community per se could ever do. But I'll work my way around to this by looking at the biohacking movement first. I don't want to take a lot of time going over critical debates about how we might define the posthuman or the transhuman. Those debates have been, really well covered in other places. I'm just going to tell you what I think the words mean. That way you'll know where I'm starting from, and you can argue with me from there. So the posthuman. My understanding of this word is bloody-mindedly literal. I take it to mean after the human, in the same way that post signifies for any other body or movement. Beyond a shift in thinking from the individual and the container of the skin to cybernetic flows of information, the word implies extinction and a variety of reactions to that, but all of which are predicated on the idea that the earlier thing is over. Its moment has come and gone. The thing, body, practice, movement, that originally bore that name is embedded in time, regardless of the influences feeding into and out of it, or any resurgences that might bear the prefix neo. So to my mind, then, nowhere is it more obvious that we are not now, in any literal sense, posthuman than on social media. The transhuman I take to mean the transcendent human, the human being extending itself, the human that wants to go further and faster, the human that wants to be stronger, to live longer, the human that wants to live forever even. There is no post here. Indeed, quite the opposite. The transhuman stands in stark contrast to the posthuman, because if posthumanism's apparent project is to decenter the human by ghosting it, what transhumanism does is to aggressively ego-center the human. The biohacking movement has been a chief contributor to the egocentrism of the transhuman. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating for either one. I think we need to back off these extremes. So what is biohacking? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as the practice of biological experimentation, as by gene editing or the use of drugs or implants, done to improve the qualities or capabilities of living organisms, especially by individuals and groups working outside a traditional medical or scientific research environment. The especially is an interesting qualifier, but we'll come back to that. Otherwise, this is a decent start. By this definition, bodybuilders are biohackers. Anyone listening to binaural beats to modulate their brainwave frequencies or their dopamine response is a biohacker. People using red light therapy to improve their skin collagen are biohackers. Let's just flesh out this definition, though, with a set of high-profile case examples, which taken together nicely illustrate both the range of practices encompassed by the movement and the tenor. Some of the well-known personalities in the popular biohacking community include the self-made corporate guru, Dave Asprey, whose company Bulletproof is now a multi-million-dollar purveyor of nutritional supplements and nootropics, and whose informational podcasts and YouTube videos on all topics biohacking have views in the millions. Also, the social media savvy biomedical researchers, Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn and Dr. David Sinclair. Both are lauded contributors to anti-aging research, but they disagree vehemently on the key initiator of cell aging. For example, Blackburn's research pinpoints telomerase activators, and I've listed her product that you can buy. It's quite expensive, TA65, for which she received a Nobel Prize actually in 2009. While Sinclair's research focuses on resveratrol's ability to prevent or slow down aging by inhibiting the expression of sirtuins. And you can also buy Sinclair's brand of resveratrol. Both Blackburn and Sinclair have been on the podcast circuit talking about their work, their books, and the supplements developed from their research, in which, of course, they have a financial stake. I would be remiss not to at least mention the infamous Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos founder and CEO, who was indicted by a US federal grand jury on 9 counts of fraud and conspiracy in 2021 and was convicted on 4 counts in March of 2022. I don't want to say too much about her. I'm sure if you've been reading the news about Holmes, you know quite a bit about it already. I just want to say that her name has become synonymous with the utopian promises of biomedical technologies fronting fraudulent for-profits, and again, for money laundering. What these case examples show is that biohacking as a popular movement easily spans the divide between expert and layperson, scientist and influencer, hacker and scammer. Nor should we be surprised that biohacking's foundational impulse is self-promotion. This self-promotion is not only about money, it's also about metrics, although these are functionally the same thing. To the case examples of biohackers I just listed, let me also add a product example. The popular biohacking movement also spans the divide between ingestible and wearable. The Oura Ring is a wearable product that illustrates the utopian promise of metrics for consumers, claiming to track key statistical indicators of health and well-being. In the biohacking biz, metrics are the gold standard of information. In order to optimize human health and performance, first we need to track it. Never mind feeling healthy or strong or happy, metrics let us know for sure, and they tell us that we're improving, extending our limits by offering us quantifiable indicators, such as those the Oura Ring purports to track: heart rate, temperature, calories burned, percentage of deep sleep, ketone levels, and so on. The human may seek the reassurance of such metrics, but the human being is still the most important component of this transhuman project, the individual, physical human, and all its tiny little processes and quirks, minutely measured, the individual writ large and unique. We can take this even further. Dave Asprey owes his influencer and DIY biohacker status to a multitude of metrics-heavy technical reviews, documenting his own self-experimentation with everything from MCT oil to hyperbaric chamber therapy. While Blackburn and Sinclair argue over the ITP data, and Holmes got into trouble by raising $9 billion of investor funding on falsified lab reports that claimed to deliver customers over 240 precise biomarker measurements from one tiny blood sample. I want to add a final case. Aaron Trewick. He was a biohacker and blogger with no biomedical expertise whatsoever. He used social media to crowdfund a gene therapy company called Ascendance Biomedical. And then he died sensationally in a sensory deprivation tank. This made headline news in 2018. And as you can see, a fairly recent documentary about his life, which the director insists also stars him from archival footage. Trewick is interesting because his dream was to bypass the regulations of the American FDA and the legislative strictures of human clinical trials. His solution, like Asprey's, was to simply experiment on himself. But his death was a flashpoint for a new Cold War between subjective, evidence-based citizen science in conflict with the curated, regulated clinical science. His death resulted in, on the one hand, calls to protect well-meaning DIY biohackers from themselves, and on the other hand, the rallying cry that the movement is profoundly populist and breaking down the distinctions between citizen scientists and clinicians is actually its whole point. Regardless, notice the egocentric focus which is mobilizing this movement. Biohackers are hyper-focused on the body and on the beingness of it, touting self-improvement through holistic mind-body connection and the biomedical technologies that claim to strengthen that. This is why I say that transhumanism, as it is exemplified by the popular biohacking movement, is about ego-centering the human rather than decentering. Would it be cynical to say that the dream of transhumanism, according to biohackers, is not really to extend human health, performance, and lifespan, but rather to keep their bodies attractive, their reputations brainy, and their wallets fat? I fear that the stink of fraud hangs over the entire movement. Notice too that biohacking as a popular movement would not exist without social media. My discussion so far has been saturated with references to podcasts, influencers, and YouTube. William Gibson's portrayal of the early internet as a contested site, a kind of Wild West frontier, striated by the hustle of hackers and the powerful interests of big tech, applies just as well to our current situation with biomedical technologies and the biohacking community. In one of his recent books, Jonathan Haidt argues that the collection of sites and apps we know as social media represents a concentrated version of the early internet, and that it has operated as a largely unregulated Wild West for its users, a contested space dominated but not controlled by big tech or by governments, though both are trying. Haidt's essential point is that social media is creating social and political destabilization globally for two reasons: the ever more sophisticated deployment of tactical disinformation and the algorithmic obedience to cognitive bias. That is the idea that social media is causing the polarizations we are seeing because its algorithms feed people more and more of the content they're already consuming. It's no wonder that personal and anecdotal evidence has the same footing as expert reviews and clinical trial reports for biohackers on social media. So how can consumers navigate this terrain? This is not transcendence. This is not extension. This is chaos. It is wildly partisan and at the same time monetized, even weaponized anarchy. Musk's recent purchase of Twitter may prove to be another flashpoint. I think we'll see fairly soon. The conflict between individual, corporate, and government control over this contested space, Haidt compellingly argues, is really just beginning. Let's stay with Haidt for just a minute longer. There is a question I want to ask. Haidt does not think that censorship will fix things. He says we need to change the algorithms. Stop feeding people suggested and viral content that traps them in a bubble of self-affirmation. I like what Haidt's saying about social media. It makes a lot of sense to me. It has also shifted my thinking about biohacking in general. It prompts me to ask, is social media itself a form of biohacking? In its extension of our identities and its representations of our bodies online, does it replicate the biohacker's dream of the superhuman, of appearing more attractive, smarter, richer, and influencing others as a result? Or are biohackers replicating the dreams of social media, quantified by the number of views, likes, reshares, and subscribers? And so if users are extending their bodies and or their beliefs onto and through social media so that the reflection of the human being social media provides is fully ego-centered, is social media an example of the transhuman? I'm not suggesting that we try to stuff any genies back into their bottles. I'm not saying get off Instagram, but I'm not that happy with Haidt's solution either, that we just change the algorithms. I think what I would rather do is that we free ourselves from the idea that our evolution is defined by our relationship with technology. That we think of ourselves not as post-human, where with the help of our technology, we become something else, something beyond, something that places the human as a past moment, and not as transhuman, where with the help of our technology, we become the better human, the optimum specimen of the human. What if instead we think of ourselves as merely human? No less and no more. No post and no most. I think this is the only way we're going to be able to tackle what is in front of us. Just because the system isn't perfect doesn't mean it isn't a good one. Does this mean I'm advocating for a return to the old flawed humanism? I don't know. I haven't thought this bit out yet. Maybe neo-humanism? Maybe humanism 2.0? But as I said, this is a work in progress. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I have several questions for that. Personally, I think a return to humanism would not be a bad thing. But we'll generally hold our questions for the end. Though I did think, there's some interesting insights. There's some nice research around questions about like the quantified self, which is loosely tied to biohacking. But sort of predates the biohacking that you're talking about. But there's biohacking that predates that biohacking, of course, which is the perpetual problem we have, right? When did the whole thing and the problem start? And I would suggest that, I think you're onto it with the egoism. And I would point back to, like Scott Lash's critique of narcissism in the late 60s and 70s and how that has basically become what we have today with social media. For questions, I don't know. We'll have a discussion afterwards, I suppose. And the discussion will continue with everybody involved. But for right now, we'll go on to Professor Teresa Heffernan. Teresa Heffernan is a professor of English language and literature at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her current research is on the science and fiction of robotics and AI. Her books include the edited collection Cyborg Futures, Cross-Disciplinary Perspectives on Artificial Intelligence and Robotics by Paul Grove, 2019, Veiled Figures, Women, Modernity, and the Specters of Orientalism, 2016, and Post-Apocalyptic Cultures, Modernism, Postmodernism, and the 20th Century Novel, 2008. She oversees the website socialrobotfutures.com, which I looked at today and was really interesting. So if you want to take it away, please do.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you also to Julia and Russ for organizing this panel. And that was a great paper, Andrea, thanks. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so I just want to tell you a bit about my background. Back in 2000, I co-organized two panels. One was the politics of posthumanism, and the other was the theory of posthumanism. It was at the Cultural Studies Conference in Birmingham, which was the basis of this special issue on critical posthumanism that we published in 2003 with Cultural Critique. So broadly, it addressed debates about how new technologies are opening up questions about what it means to be human. And Catherine Hales wrote the afterword for us. Following that issue, though, I traveled to robot labs in Japan, in Europe, and the US, and I interviewed many people in the field of AI and computer science. So I'm going to just talk about say a few words about the posthuman turn, and then talk about some of the problems I came to see with this turn based on my travels. So posthuman theorists have responded to the problems of rights discourse by decentering the liberal humanist subject and replacing it with what Rosie Braidotti refers to as the moral philosophy of rights with an ethics of sustainability that calls into question the autonomy of the human. So wired, hybridized, networked, biotic, abiotic, organic, and inorganic, continuous with both the animal and the machine, the human, in Donna Haraway's well-known 1980s phrases, is better thought of as a cyborg. Following Haraway, many have included AI technology, robots, and animals in their wide embrace. Braidotti, for instance, in moving away from anthropocentrism, proposes, quote, undoing the human by acknowledging multiple belongings and a zoa-centered egalitarianism that includes animals and smart technologies, and a non-dualistic understanding of nature-culture interaction. Catherine Hales also critiques the autonomous liberal humanist model of subjectivity, arguing that humans extend into smart environments that exceed individual cognition. Cognition itself, then, she argues, is distributed between human and non-human agents. Hale argues that this, quote, dynamic partnership between humans and intelligent machines will temper the humanist desire to, quote, dominate and control nature. She proposes that we craft a version of the posthuman that sustains the, quote, long survival of human and other life forms, biological and artificial, with whom we share this planet. In other words, the messy, interconnected nature-culture embeddedness of the posthuman, techno-human animal challenges the idea of autonomous rights deserving human that stands out as unique against a backdrop of the entire non-human world. If our sense of our own uniqueness has encouraged the domination and exploitation of this planet, accepting our lack of uniqueness, some critical posthumanists suggest, may turn out to be the best way to preserve it. More recently, Joshua Keller, like Kate Darling and David Gunkel, has embraced multiple belongings and this posthuman turn, arguing that we should extend rights to robots And in his book, Rights for Robots, Artificial Intelligence, Animal and Environmental Law, Gallo argues that non-Western and indigenous worldviews, ecological sensitivity, and critical post-human and critical environmental ethics should inform debates about robots, proposing that kinship may well offer one of the best models of legal and moral obligation. Sorry, can everyone see the entire screen? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so in his view, kinship resists anthropomorphism, embraces both inanimate and animate entities, and understands that, quote, humans are not one strand in a larger web of relations humans are but one strand in the larger web of relations that foster responsibility among its constituent elements. In When Species Meet, Haraway too argues for a queer kin group that finds lap dogs and laptops in the same commodious lap. Yet Geller, though clearly concerned with the environment, does not mention the many environmental and societal costs of the robot AI industry. To name a few, the troll factories, that Andrea was also alluding to, the troll factories and disinformation that are eroding democracy, the biased algorithms that accelerate social prejudice, the AI arms race that wants to automate war, the conflict minerals used in many of the smart technologies that perpetuate colonialism and violate human rights, the implementation of platform capitalism that relies on Foxconn factories and ghost work, and that dehumanizes labor, circumvents all regulations, and concentrates wealth in the hands of big tech CEOs. The e-waste, of which we produce 53.6 million metric tons in 2019, and algorithms that produce fast consumption. In other words, the robotics AI industry is in direct competition with the non-human lakes, rivers, animals, oceans, forests, wetlands, mountains, and jungles. Data centers, for instance, require on average 3 to 5 million gallons of water per day, and there are about 3 million data centers in the US alone, forcing humans and other animals to fight with corporations over scarce resources in ever-increasing drought-stricken areas around the globe. The prophets of artificial intelligence have long been announcing the impending birth of a superintelligence that has the potential to either destroy and or renew the world. Curious about the premises of this claim and whether there was any science behind the view that machines were becoming more lifelike, with the help of a SSHRC grant, I embarked on my travels around about 2013 with Karen Asp, who was working on her PhD at York. For instance, we visited Ishiguro's lab in Japan. He has plastic surgery as he ages, so he will continue to look like his Geminoid. And this is me with the hugging telenoid. And this is a still from a video that's up on our website. We also stayed at a hotel staffed by robots, and I blogged about it, concluding that although the robots are promoted as warm and friendly, and guests are invited to converse with them as they, quote, go efficiently about their work, it quickly becomes clear that the robots follow a set script, and the process is in fact about getting the guests trained on self-check-in. I imagine being greeted by this efficient technology late at night on some strip of generic highway lined with cheap motels and fast food restaurants, and pondered how long it would take a human to appear on the scene to fix the system if it was outdated or failed, as technology is wont to do. I was on a panel with Henrik Scharf and his Gemini DK in Dublin, and then visited his lab in Denmark. He made the list of the top 100 most influential people in Time magazine in 2012, and his Geminoid has its own tailor. He never would tell me where the financing came for that Geminoid. I interviewed Jeffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, as he's known, who talked about how the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research saved his soul, as he didn't have to take money from the military anymore, even as he knew they were using his research. He's convinced that we're on the verge of understanding the brain. The more I traveled, the more I grew skeptical about this technology with its grand claims about building brains and birthing human-like robots. I wondered whether multiple belongings, queer kin groups, and the posthuman was any better at addressing the crisis we are in than the liberal humanist rights-based arguments that place the human at the center. The posthuman call to decenter the human groups the biological with the artificial, the organic with the synthetic, but ignores the giant material footprint of the smart technology industry. Doesn't grouping lapdogs and laptops in the same kin group glide over the incrementability between animals and machines and recenter the human lab? Humans are certainly continuous with the technological and the animal, but if ecological systems and the long-range survival of life on the planet are the concern, the resurrection of the Cartesian collapse of animals and machines needs to be challenged. In Discourse on Method, Descartes, infamous for arguing that there's no difference between beating an animal and beating a machine, also argued that while it might be possible to build a mechanical monkey that was indistinguishable from a real monkey, a human would always be distinguishable from an automaton, as humans have reason, understanding, and language. Alan Turing, one of the founders of artificial intelligence, also grouped machines with animals in his 1950s paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. But unlike Descartes, he maintained that human-like intelligence was buildable. Equating computer programming with procreating, Turing imagined himself conceiving and bearing what he refers to as his child machine. Another of the fathers of AI, Norbert Wiener, published God and Golem in 1964. He proposed to undo the dichotomy between living and non-living things in the new science of cybernetics, which he defines as the science of communication and control in the animal and the machine. Wiener, however, was ambivalent about his own project and wrote in 1950, "Those who suffer from a power complex find the mechanization of man a simple way to realize their ambitions." His series, nevertheless, have shaped the development of modern AI, which have adopted Wiener's premise that equates humans with computers. This mechanistic view of humans is often discussed in contrast to a religious view. In other words, the former holds that science can discover and explain how humans work and in turn simulate the human, as opposed to the latter idea of the human as a unique a unique creation of a divine universe. However, rather than breaking with religion and apocalyptic rhetoric, Wiener revives it. While Wiener asks his readers to be, quote, good heretics for the sake of science and to consider the, quote, heresy of machines and living beings in the same breath, the connection to Golem, a figure from Jewish mysticism, paradoxically better situates the field in myth and magic. In 1965, Gershom Shalom, an authority on Jewish mysticism, was invited to give a dedication to a computer that he had named Golem Aleph, which had been built at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. Shalom explained his reasons for this naming by recounting the story of Golem. In one of the best known versions of this Jewish lore, Golem is a clay creature brought to life by the magical powers of Rabbi Lo, a mystic in Prague. Sholem posited that this 16th century rabbi was the spiritual ancestor of Wiener and his collaborator, John von Neumann, the early inventors of the computer. Professed by mystics who believe that prime elements of numbers and letters are the, quote, building stones of the world and produce life, the Jewish story is linked to the Kabbalist tradition. In Sholem's assessment, the Kabbalist belief in the mystical power of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet that animate Golem is comparable to the faith in the much simpler binary number system of computers. Experimental demonology, magic, and applied mathematics, Sholem concluded, had much in common. Over 50 years later, we have transhumanists, the singularity, and a new, though short-lived religion started by a Google and Uber engineer, and to back up Andrea here, who's also charged with fraud, that calls itself the way of the future and declares its mandate as, quote, the realization, acceptance, and worship of a Godhead based on AI developed through computer hardware and software. This new religion promises the coming of a superintelligence and the transcendence of a biological body. If the rise of science challenged the religious worldview, AI has returned to promises of immortality, miracles, and magic. The separation of the spirit mind and the body spun off into theories of the Turing machine and computationalism in the 50s. In other words, the belief that states of mind can be translated into algorithms hosted by a machine body. Dmitry Ishkov's Avatar 2045 project, Hans Moravec's prediction of downloading brains into computers, and Elon Musk's Neuralink Corporation offer contemporary versions of this same faith. From Marvin Minsky to Jeffrey Hinton, many in the AI world share the belief that animals, including humans, are machines. Minsky says, people object to the idea of humans as machines because people do not know any computer science and do not have an architectural theory that explains how the body and mind work. So they assume that there is some soul or spirit that explains it all. Yet his circular argument begs the question about why an overarching model proposed by the recent field of computer science that excludes things like history, culture, evolution, and the environmental impact of computing technologies offers any better explanation than the soul or spirit in describing the complexity of life on this planet. Who is funding this version of the future? In 2007, Bill Gates published a piece in Scientific America about the parallels between the computer market and the robotics industry, predicting that robots would prove as lucrative a market as computers and cell phones. The global capital pushing these technologies is enormous. For instance, in 2021, the Japanese multinational conglomerate SoftBank Group, as it moved away from investment in solar to investment in AI and robotics, had a net profit of almost $46 billion. SoftBank bought the French robotics firm that produces the robots Pepper and Neo, and also bought Boston Dynamics from Alphabet Inc., which is Google's parent company. Boston Dynamics has developed the robots like Big Dog and Spot with funding from DARPA, a wing of the US military. SoftBank also runs Vision Fund, the world's largest technology-focused venture capital. Saudi Arabia is its biggest investor, but others include Apple, Larry Ellison of Oracle, and Foxconn. If you follow the money of smart technologies, the trail leads not only to DARPA, but to Saudi princes, Russian oligarchs, Silicon Valley's billionaire dinners, MIT Media Labs, and the convicted sex trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein, who hosted Minsky's AI conferences on his pedo island. Well, Haraway's 1985 manifesto was hopeful that the cyborg would betray its origin in militarism, capitalism, and patriarchy, and that the disenfranchised Asian women employed to build the tech would wrest control of it. There have been few signs of a successful revolt. Instead, over the last decade, we've witnessed the massive concentration of wealth and power in the hands of big tech. If you look at these billionaires and the growth, just over 13 months, in fact, you see at the top, Bezos, Musk, Gates, Zuckerberg, Ellison, Page, Brin. So from sex robots to robotic pets to smart technologies, the proliferation of robots and AI stands in sharp contrast to the precipitous decline of the human-triggered loss of animals and biodiversity. The comparison of animals to machines ignores the fact that smart technology is a multi-billion-dollar industry and that multinationals own the computing power, data storage, and online platforms that fuel these machines. What often gets lost in the discussion of AI, and this is really the basis of my work or the questions I have, are the differences between the organic and synthetic, languages and code, machines and nature, the computer and the brain, living things, that things and living matter, and science and fiction. After several decades of the AI industry trying to distract us with stories of lifelike machines, perhaps it is time to jump off this treadmill of corporate technological determinism and revisit the question of what it is to be human and what makes for a healthy planet. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Heffernan. Yeah, I've always loved Haraway, and I love that essay. It was actually published originally the year I was born, 1972. It's very, and to me it's as alive today as it ever was. And I find the conclusion to be the most powerful, which is we have to live in solidarity with the world, but also solidarity with each other. And that's because it was published in a California Marxist magazine originally, which was a fun little tract. I think I have an original copy of it someplace. We republished it in one of my books a long time ago with Donna's permission. Yeah, there's a ton of excellent information in your work, and I think the things that I would point to is, the queer kinship is really the interesting transformation toward robotics and technologies, because the queering and the estranging of the relationship is what will give us the distance to be critical and to find the power to restate the critiques, because the ones we've been using, of course, we've been saying money is the problem. They ignore it. Money is the problem still. It's not changing. Anyway, to go on, yes, we still have William. I forgot William, and I should apologize to William because he was supposed to be second in my book. And we are going on now to William and limiting my commentary. So Dr. Brown is an assistant professor of film at the University of British Columbia, as well as an honorary fellow of the School of Arts at the University of Roehampton, London. He is author of Non-Cinema, Global Digital Filmmaking and the Multitude from Bloomsbury, 2018, and David H. Fleming of the Squid Cinema of Hell, Kinotusists, Infernals, and the Emergence of Cthulhu Media. I always have problems with Cthulhu. At the Edinburgh University Press. Forthcoming works including Navigating the White Anthropocene to the Black Cthulhu Scenes from Zero Books, and Infinite Ontology, Streaming Media in the Cthulhu Scene, with David H. Fleming under consideration. He is also the maker of No Budget Films, including This Is Simina in 2018 and Mantis forthcoming. So off we go with Dr. Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that introduction. Thank you to Julia for the very kind invitation, also supplemented by Russ's involvement as well. So thank you to everyone. I hope that you can hear me. I'm going to talk about a show called Devs, and I don't know if people have seen it, and if you haven't, I apologize. There'll be some huge spoilers, and B, well, I just hope it kind of isn't too alienating if you haven't seen it, but it raises some interesting ideas that may or may not chime with the consideration of largely white men that we've had up until now, and we'll see if we can go in some different directions. Just to say, I'm talking to you from the unceded traditional and ancestral land of the Musqueam peoples in Point Grey in Vancouver. So as Jeremy mentioned, this is part of, well, mentioned that there's a book that I have under consideration with Edinburgh University Press called Infinite Ontology, and that's, I've just put up what that's supposed to look like in the chat. It's a kind of play of sorts on object-oriented ontology, but using the infinite sign to take us in a different direction and to get to points of disagreement with that discourse that I and my co-author have, but which I won't be able to get into today. I'll do my best to get through this talk as quickly as I can, and I don't think I'll ever have time to respond to questions from Bill Wells if he posts as many to me as he has to everyone else, but I'll do my best if I can get there. I'm going to share my screen. Right. So Devs is set primarily in and around a tech company, Amaya, the campus of which is on the outskirts of San Francisco, and which has been a leading light in the evolution of quantum computing. Amaya, which is named after the now dead daughter of the company's founder, Forrest, houses a special development unit, or Devs. In principle, no one knows what happens in Devs, but in the first episode, we follow Sergei, a programmer of Russian origin who is invited to join the Devs team, and who upon arrival tries to steal data only to get busted. Sergei is murdered, of course, by Forrest's head of security, Kenton, with the death made to seem like a suicide. Sergei's death prompts his partner, Lily, a Chinese woman by birth, but who moved to the USA in childhood, to investigate what has happened. The viewers and Lily, who also works at Amaya as an encryption coder, both discover that Devs basically involves the computation of the whole of reality, such that any moment in history, which in principle means not just human history, but the history of the entire universe or multiverse, is observable and knowable. There are scenes where the characters peruse historical moments, including the crucifixion of Christ. And what follows is a convoluted plot in which Lily effectively threatens to expose Forrest and Amaya, only to find herself finally inside the Devs machine, living within a simulation of reality in which Forrest is reunited with his otherwise deceased wife, Leanne, and his daughter, Amaya. The fullest version of this paper includes an analysis of how Lily is a simultaneous embodiment of the Asian model minority, the cyber coolie, the yellow peril, as a Chinese woman, she is perceived as a threat to the security of the Devs system, and an embodiment of the self-sacrificing Madame Butterfly, as seen in the final reunion of the White family, thanks to her self-sacrifice, where notably Amaya is played by actress Sonoe Mizuno's real-world daughter, Amaya Mizuno Andre. So the child of the Asian woman is given over to the White family, as in Madame Butterfly, effectively. So it argues, the chapter would argue, the wider piece of writing, for the role of the coolie in the construction of tech cool, as well as how the show demonstrates the ongoing nature of the Cold War, since it has at its core Sino-Russian versus American tech rivalries, all very redolent of the current age, as well as typical for Alex Garland, especially Ex Machina. Furthermore, the long version looks not only at how even a smidgen of critical theory, perhaps especially media and or film theory, would help the characters in the film not to mistake the computer's representations for reality. And I kind of have this thing about tech geniuses are fucking morons when it comes to their ability to engage with critical theory. But anyway, this would help the characters in the film not to mistake the computer's representations for reality, but also how the simulation provided by the devs machine is distinctly cinematic, and thus an old media remediation of new media, while also involving a kind of appropriation of indigenous land and iconography in its construction of an American future or settler colonialism as usual. I'll happily discuss those elements to the best of my recall in the Q&A, but today I'm going to pick up on how it's weird that the algorithm knows how to capture perfectly a voice recording of Christ 2,000 years ago in terms of where to place the microphone, the camera, and so on, all without affecting the performances that we see. I make this point to suggest that the devs machine, as it's elaborated in the show, is anthropocentric, offering up a human view of the world rather than a quantum view, even though the machine is supposedly a quantum computer. And what's crucial to my argument here is that this anthropocentrism is raced, not as a byproduct of its development, but in its very conception. As Celine Parenius-Shimizu has explained, the dominance of visuality in understanding the world when seeing does not necessarily mean knowing, since there are many other ways that we can know beyond simply hearing and seeing, even as the devs machine privileges only those human senses. And this visual knowledge is itself not only predicated upon certain biases, for example, the fact that the lens of most cinematographic cameras are calibrated to capture accurately white skin rather than black, brown, or yellow skin, as Richard Dyer has so famously pointed out. But it's also predicated upon reducing the human only to a body, an object, with non-white bodies being unprivileged objects in a system that privileges the white body as the only subject, the only thing with spirit. To become an object or an image is to undergo passion, and thus to be what Byung-Chul Han terms good entertainment, as per a particularly Protestant logic or conception of the world. In short, it's only by becoming white and by capitulating to the exclusive and damaging logic of whiteness that one can be recognized as real. As Han summarizes, entertainment thus maintains the world. Entertaining is also maintaining. Television does not passively display an objective reality. Instead, it actively produces reality, or that which must be taken as read white machine. And while the white forest and his family is thus produced by and for the devs machine, it is the non-white Lily who is sacrificed for this to take place. In Peter X. Feng's language, Lily is thus screened, not just in the sense that devs as a show screens her sacrifice, but also in the sense that she is screened or surveilled and thus screened out of the white reality, necessary for its construction as per any model Madame Butterfly, but also excluded from it, as per her reconciliation with former Asian partner Jamie at the show's end would seem to indicate. There was a picture of Jamie earlier. This white reality involves then a cinematic screening process that includes some whites and that in various ways excludes others, non-whites, including a paradoxical exclusion via inclusion for the yellow body. For if we've suggested that Lily is interned within the dev system at the climax of the show, this is because internment is a historical process that has a standing association with Asian/Americans, most pointedly in the form of internment camps devised during the Second World War for Nikkei, the term given to Japanese migrants across generations. As Candice Chu argues, internment exemplifies the suturing of the unity of the US nation by means of differentiating between those who do and do not belong through the deployment of race, a category that in this context signifies national origins. In this way, internment speaks of knowledge produced by racism and patriotism, the promulgation of devotion to the fatherland that demands different demonstrations of loyalty from the nation's would-be sons and daughters. It's telling then that Lily is first interrogated by Kenton, that when this happens, he treats her with suspicion on account of her perceived Chineseness. Despite her claim to be Asian American, Lily is clearly framed as an outsider, and her sacrifice, whereby she is interned within the dev's simulation that allows Forrest to reunite with his family, is imposed upon her as a means of demonstrating her national identity and her loyalty to Forrest, the nuclear family, whiteness, and American manifest destiny. It's even more telling, perhaps, that Lily is played by a mixed-race Japanese-British woman, Sonoya Mizuno, who's not Chinese at all. For not only does this mean that her internment within the dev system carries a trace of specifically Japanese targeted racism, but it also demonstrates how the distinctions between different Asian identities, Japanese, Chinese, are basically dismissed as Asian, and that this, which emerges as a single unified identity and under which all under which heading all bodies become fungible. Sorry, I've got a dog barking. She might continue doing that, so I apologize. If Debs reveals the ongoing logic of the internment camp within the contemporary USA, then there might also be a sense in which the campuses of tech companies like Amaya themselves function as internment campuses or camps in contemporary business culture. For as is explained to Sergey when he first arrives at the Debs building, he's free to work whatever hours that he wants at Debs, and thus in principle can come and go as he pleases. However, this freedom to leave clearly masks an expectation that one in fact makes the campus one's home and one's life, as is made particularly clear when Sergey is promptly killed for trying to leave the campus. As personal computers and smartphones have led to the invasion of work into domestic space, so does this supposed freedom to work when one wants, means, in fact, that one is always at work, as is demonstrated by the fact that, with the exception of programmer Stuart, the characters in Devs basically only ever talk about work and meet up at all hours of the day and night to do so, with no one ever protesting that they're not on the clock and that these matters can wait until business hours. If this logic of permanent work is accepted, then to go to and to be more or less permanently on campus, and I think this relates to universities as well, means that all tech work has become interned in the contemporary workplace with its camp or campus logic, which is not to mention literal interns who might often be exploited in terms of payment or lack thereof in return for their labor, but which they willingly undertake because of the cool brand or reputation of the tech company for which they're working. As submitting oneself to internment in a camp during the Second World War demonstrated a fidelity to the USA, even as it paradoxically marked one's outsider status to white America, it goes like this: prove that you're a true American by living in this camp designed for non-Americans. So does submitting oneself to the tech campus, especially as an intern, demonstrate one's fidelity to the tech brand. Since a campus functions like a cult compound, both in its seclusion and in the sacrifice of one's non-cult life as one moves to the compound or campus, so do we see clearly how and why tech companies involve cultish followings and would-be guru-style leaders, even as those companies may in fact be led by uncritical and unreflective thinkers, typically white men like Forrest in Devs. For the tech campus is simply an extension of the logic of American capitalism, to bring about the sacrifice of workers whose very sacrifice will prove their fidelity to the cause of techno-capitalism, while those who resist or protest this sacrifice will make for good entertainment by being crucified or equivalent. I normally continue here with an analysis of how coolness, the coolie, and the ongoing Cold War logic are all at work in Devs, giving it a thermal aesthetic that relates to the medium cool of television. Logic also at work in the treatment of Joan Chen's Josie Packard in Twin Peaks, which Mila Zuo perceptively analyzes in her recent Vulgar Beauty, Acting Chinese and Global Sensorium. If you recall, there's Josie on the left there. Josie notably ends up being transmogrified into a doorknob or a perfect ornament. This then leads to considerations of coolness and what Vivian L. Huang terms Asian inscrutability, and considerations of what Xian Ngai calls the zany, cute, and interesting. For Ngai, each of these is a formless or amorphous kind of form, with the cute in particular being squishy and soft, such that our desire to cuddle with the commodity might often be shadowed by a tiny feeling of repugnance, as well as a sense that the cute object can be helpless and aggressive at the same time. Not unlike the ornament, the cute is doll-like, dolls are cute, but the uncanny valley, whereby the cute doll can look almost too real, demonstrates a sense of unease around it. The cute object, and Guy continues, seems to insist on getting something from us, care, affection, or intimacy, that we in turn feel compelled to give, with the result often being that cuteness is not just an aestheticization, but an eroticization of powerlessness, evoking tenderness for small things, but also sometimes a desire to belittle or diminish them further. The way in which Lily is figured as cute in Devs is hopefully clear. She has a softness about her that is indeed doll-like, with various men, especially Jamie and this other character, Pete, coming to her rescue and helping her. She nonetheless also repels Kenton, that security guy, and in some respects Forrest, the tech guru, who do indeed belittle and diminish her further. That Lily is played by Sonoya Mizuno, who in Garland's Ex Machina played a doll that spans the uncanny valley, only enhances her cuteness. The reason for discussing the cute and the interesting in relation to Devs is that these two categories are both, as Ngai suggests, formless. In his short text on the formless, or the informe, Georges Bataille says, for academic men to be happy, and that's a good number of people here, the universe would have to take shape. All of philosophy has no other goal. It's a matter of giving a frock coat to what is, a mathematical frock coat. On the other hand, affirming that the universe resembles nothing and is only formless amounts to saying that the universe is something like a spider or spit. What's important here to pick out is that Bataille considers the universe itself to be informe, and that it is men, especially academic men and philosophers, who apply form to the world. Western philosophy is built upon and inextricable from the creation of form, from the formless or informe. It is also about the dismissal of the formless or the informe as useless. And yet, the informe is also at the heart of information culture, as can be seen by the way in which John Zachary Young's work on the cephalopod brain became influential in the 1940s in the development of early computers and artificial intelligence. Since the octopus was in effect the model for early computers, and since the octopus is a boneless and informe creature, often thought of as alien, then the computer, artificial intelligence, and digital culture more generally carry within them a similar informe property to the octopus. That is, information technology is itself informe. When we consider the relationship between the informe and form in devs, it seems clear that Forrest, as the white patriarch, dislikes the informe, even as he needs the informe Lily to sacrifice herself for the dev simulation come the end of the series. For Forrest rejects the early and noisy, i.e. formless versions of the dev's data, information, that are produced by the dev's machine. Forrest's dissatisfaction with or unease around the informe is curious, given that he's a famous developer of quantum computing. For if the code of a digital computer is made up of ones and zeros, it nonetheless is binaristic in that the code can only read 0 or 1. That is, the code must always take a definite form. Quantum computing, meanwhile, involves, at least in principle, the possibility for a 1 also to be a 0 at the same time. That is, rather than an either-or logic, the quantum computer has a both and logic. This ability to take on two positions, 1 and 0, at the same time is referred to as superposition, and it in some senses retains or harnesses the potential of data as potential. It could be a 1 or 0, so it can be both 1 or 0 at the same time, rather than reducing it to actuality, 0 or 1. If Forrest properly understood the logic of his own computing system, then he would know, in effect, that it does not matter whether it is a Maya 1 or not a Maya 0, but that it can be both a Maya and not a Maya at the same time, 1 and 0. In other words, Forrest hates information. He only has a typically white and Western preference for knowledge. This distinction between information and knowledge is suggested by Chun when she argues that the internet was founded, by Wendy Chun, that the internet was founded on the notion that better information means better knowledge, but that this equation quickly proved illusory. Meanwhile, Candace Chun similarly suggests that those for whom information flows are sedimented into objects of area study, where those for whom knowledge flows are coetaneously empowered with a subjective authority to evaluate that information. In other words, information is raw, whilst knowledge puts information into a hierarchy, it evaluates information, which in turn puts knowledge above information in a perceived hierarchy. In the language used above, information is, unsurprisingly, informe, while knowledge gives form to the informe. In giving form to the informe, knowledge thus determines what is real and what is not real, with knowledge thus being or becoming a technology for determining reality. Just as television, in the estimation of Byung-Chul Han, equally determines what is real, and just as cinematic form within the show devs also gives form to and determines what is real. Knowledge thus is oculocentric, with the devs machine not simply being a tool for receiving information about a reality that surrounds us, and from which it might mythically be detached. Instead, the form that it gives to the information it has received is a means of shaping what is accepted as being or as existing and what is not. In effect, Forrest emerges as a megalomaniac who gets to determine what is real, and who determines as real the life of his daughter. In order to give form to Amaya and his family, though, he must destroy the informe, which here becomes metonymically expressed in Lily, the cool Asian dragon lady come lotus blossom come model minority come interned coolly. In insisting upon the validity of only one reality, Forrest not only expresses the white American myth of a pluribus unum, but he also reveals how the plures out of which the unum should emerge are in fact constitutively, not merely accidentally, antagonistic to it. For the non-white must be suppressed for the creation of the white world, and any alternative reality is diminished in relation to it. In this sense, Forrest's utopia emerges, as Han suggests, as absolute entertainment, in that it involves the passion of the Asian other, Lily. To paraphrase Bataille, for Forrest to be happy, the universe has to take shape, or rather, the multiverse must take the shape of or be reduced to a mere universe. And for the multiverse to take the shape of the universe, for the inform to be given form, and for information to be given formation, the racial other must be suppressed. In other words, Lily in Devs, like Kyoko in Ex Machina, becomes non-human, with the paradox being that as she becomes pure information, a disembodied ghost in the Devs machine, she gives formation to the Devs simulation that is the simulation of the nuclear white family. From the perspective of the quantum computer, there is in principle no such thing as race. The Devs machine simply detects quanta. It has no interest or concern for their color or what they mean. The quantum realm would thus claim to be colorblind, a realm in which there is only pure information, with Lily's race being supposedly incidental to the otherwise liberatory or utopian logic at work. However, the logic of information as a utopia all too often underpins racial formation, such that race is not incidental to these narratives, but rather that these narratives exist in order to undermine information and to form, and thus to know, the racial other. That is, digital and quantum utopias alike are tools or technologies for segregation and sacrifice, systems devised to perpetuate and to naturalize racial discrimination, rather than to free us from them. As much can be seen in an aspect of the identity of Lily, or rather Sonoya Mizuno, that we have not yet clarified, namely that she's not Asian so much as mixed race. Her father is Japanese, her mother half British, half Argentine. For to be mixed race would suggest not just a multiverse without, but also a multiverse within. Identity is multiple and not exclusive. In this way, and this is a quote from Minal Mitani, it is often naively assumed that the mere presence of mixed race people augurs the dawning of a new era of racelessness and equity for all racialized peoples. However, while there is of course scope to posit that mixed race identities posit a means to think outside of binaristic either or categories, black or white, yellow or black, and so on, as per the mestiza logic of scholars like Gloria Ansaldúa, where the mestiza has a plural personality. In other senses, mixed raceness can be read as reinforcing, or perhaps better as coming up against a strict binaristic logic, whereby to be even partially black, say, means that one is still and only black, which is an argument put forward by Jared Sexton and many others. So in this sense, the quantum of quantum computing emerges as a repetition of the historical blood quantum, whereby race was measured by all divergence from pure whiteness, with any and every divergence serving to uphold the sanctity of whiteness. And if in Asian/American studies, the influential work of Michael Omi and Howard Winant on racial formation is regularly cited, far more than it seems to be in, say, Black studies, then this is perhaps because of the techno or high-tech Orientalism that links the Asian body more clearly to information. And by this token, we can posit that racial formation is not the formation of and thus knowledge about race out of otherwise informed information. Rather, information/the inform is always already raced as other, with racial formation thus involving the rejection of the other by and from white society, the casting of the other as inform and mere information. That is, race does not emerge out of the inform. The inform and information, including our contemporary information age, emerge out of race, specifically the racism that is necessary at every level, from the quantum to the cosmic, for white supremacy to take its primordial place and to remain there. By this token, race similarly does not emerge as an object of knowledge. It is the foundation of knowledge or epistemology itself. And race is not a property of ontology, such that ontology could in theory or principle exist without race, such that there could be a colorblind reality. Rather, ontology, by which we mean white ontology, emerges out of race and racialized difference. In short, everything we know, including knowledge itself, is built upon racism. And this insight can only become clear when we consider the ontology of the infinite, or when we look at infinite ontology. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, William. It reminded me a lot of some of the history of statistics stuff that I was doing way 20 some odd years ago with the origin of data and the racism implicit in the construction of the mere concept of information back in grad school. It's, you know, there's great histories out there that prove exactly what you say, and they're entirely correct. And I think that's important to keep in mind anytime when we talk about things like transhumanism and you know, or, you know, any other form of anti-humanism, right, that we construct in our world, because they're all predicated on this sort of history that we can escape. They're all contingent upon our current situatedness. And within that situatedness, we have to recognize the deep biases that we've constructed. And I think your paper does that wonderfully by pointing out it's explicit and clear when it's pointed out, but it doesn't seem it when you're just watching a fun, entertaining show, right? I've never watched the show. I did download it for a while, but I never watched it because I don't watch as much as I probably should. Well, I probably watch more than I should, just not what other people watch. In any case, to bring it all back together, there's a lot of threads going through these discussions about information, about questions of the future, about questions of othering, about integration and extrapolation. I think you're both through there. There's some questions in the thread about learning and play and other things. I don't know how we should proceed, but maybe we'll proceed with questions that the panelists have for each other. That seems like a good way to proceed. So if any of you would like to address each other with a question, that would be fine.
I have a comment. First of all, I just wanted to say, Teresa and William, I enjoyed your papers so much. Thank you. That was great to hear. And also, wow, I feel like we all sound kind of jaded. I know that personally for me, I was not this jaded in 2018. It took one small virus and one giant narcissist to do that. So it was great to hear all of your perspectives.
Other questions or comments from the panelists?
Too many. But it'd be good to have some questions from everyone to get some conversation going. I'm also considering, as best as I can, some of Bill Wells's multiple questions as well. And perhaps if we have a discussion, be able to get to some of those too. Well, of course, if Bill Wells would like to speak in person, he can do that too.
Sure. Well, let's turn to the chat. Then we have several questions in there, probably about 30 or 40. We'll try and get to most of them, so perhaps summarize some of them. So I think the first one, of course, would be for Andrea, and it's about the extended mind thesis. The impact. What do you think of the extended mind thesis's impact on neo-humanism, and which objects are extensions of the mind?
Great question. I think that really what underlies Jonathan Haidt's argument is a kind of a commonplace now, that this is exactly the problem with social media, that we are now viewing each other as more or less objects on the other end of that platform. And this is why we are seeing that kind of polarization, right? Because it's us, and then it's all those, it's just, the individual, and then it's all those other objects out there with very little distinction between them. So this, I would say, I think this is exactly why social media is plugging into some of the other points, made in the other papers about our technologies in general, and really fostering in this, like, absolutely, blowing it up in this huge bubble of narcissism. And when I say that, it took one giant narcissist to change that, I mean, the entire world is now going to have, energy and food shortages because of one narcissist's manifest destiny. And social media actually has played a huge role in that too. So, so I think in terms of the actual impact, yes, that's the objects and the narcissism. We all know that narcissists treat other people like objects. So I think the social media makes that impact really patent. So yeah, really good question. Gee, I was hoping people would ask me where they can score some bootleg telomerase activator or something like that. I can tell you that. I can tell you that if anybody wants to know those things, feel free to ask.
I'm sure that if an academic can find them, we can probably all find them, right? But I find it interesting anytime we talk about technology, there's so many models of technology-human relations. The flattening of the ontology you find with actor network theory is deeply problematic. A lot of people say because it ruins the capacity to be critical, even though, it's fundamentally a critical model. Within there, you have the same construct of sort of distributed cognition, where we not only think with our minds, but we think with all the objects around us and all the things around us, right? And this ties back into some of Bill's questions about learning and that stuff. Where does learning start? I would argue learning starts when you are born and ends when you die and doesn't stop between, right? Humans don't stop learning. They might not always learn what you want them to learn, but they don't stop learning. They learn a lot of negative things and a lot of positive things their whole lives, and they enact those as they enact those, right? And one of the problems of social media is that people get enmeshed in conversations that seem to involve them, but they're really just narcissistic engagements, right? People promoting things to sell things, people promoting things to sell themselves, people trying to engage because engagement sells things. And that is sadly, what the current mediascape has become. It was only a few years ago, people were saying that, it's no longer news, right? News doesn't sell itself. The only news you have is news that sells something else. If news isn't selling something else, it does not get published anymore. And that's a big change from when I was a kid, right? And social media is all around that, about this sort of marketing of ideas. And don't get me started on the whole marketplace of ideas fiction and the neoliberalization of all that bullshit. Excuse my language, but it really is. So there's a lot of things going on, and they're all wrapped up together. Let's see if we can find another question. I think we'll see if there's one at the bottom.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
I wanted to, I just wanted to ask Will if I worked on Ex Machina for a bit, and one of the things I came across was Alex Garland's relationship, and I cannot remember the guy. He's a computer scientist in London who has a book out called The Singularity, or it's Theories of Singularity, or something that I had read. And Garland had read his earlier book, and then several of those, when they screened Ex Machina in Silicon Valley, a lot of the kind of tech bros went out and then took Alex Garland out for dinner. And if you look at the credits of Ex Machina, a couple of them serve as consultants on the film. So I was just wondering, and you see comments like when I was reading a sort of like more from the tech people or tech industry reviewing Ex Garland or computer scientists reviewing it, they would say, oh yeah, well that seems like pretty accurate description, of the future. And I was wondering with devs if, which I watched that series, and I was just thinking, oh, this is like very similar, or continuous with some of the stuff in Ex Machina. But I was wondering if you came across that kind of that whether in the credits there's also the kind of advisory role of Google there, or people from Google.
I don't know the answer to that question. It wouldn't surprise me. Garland does research. He's not an idiot, but he also has some real blind spots that keep coming through repeatedly, and he doesn't seem to have the nous to read some of the things that people have written about his work in order to potentially address them. But that's a long-standing antagonism between scholars of film and media and people that do film and media as a profession. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. it would be, it wouldn't surprise me, I don't think, I could say.
Thanks.
Are there other questions people want to ask, or should I mine the chat for some more? Yes, Russell.
Thank you. I was putting this in the chat, but since you ask, William, just further to what you were just saying in response to Teresa, but thinking back to your presentation on devs and a point you made early on to do with you know, the style in which the show is produced, which sounds to me, I haven't seen it either, but it sounds like it's conventional enough in I guess aesthetically, stylistically. Your point about that sort of anthropomorphic gaze that one tends to find, of course, in commercial narrative film and TV and so forth. I mean, that the fault would ultimately lie, of course, with Garland, with the filmmakers themselves, right, or the producers of the show. And otherwise, I mean, what would a quantum perspective look like? You know, this kind of goes back to our SCMS panel on a truly post-humanist film style, I guess, that whole question, right? I mean, what are you saying there's an alternative to that if we could gain that perspective on the past and go back to the moment of the crucifixion or something? Like, you know, what else would you do with that?
I mean, I don't know if there's a or the moment of the crucifixion to go back to, and you know, the sort of singularity of that perspective or that request sort of is in and of itself, you know, potentially, you know, misleading in terms of finding out from a quantum perspective what on earth happens or happened or is happening or will happen. You know, the so if, just to be clear, the devs machine has recorded the whole of human history. It's kind of through the magic of television, let's just say, but it's sort of, basically it's saying that if you could get perfectly correct the information from a small space, which is the corpse of a mouse, I think it's a while since I've seen it now, but you could map the entire history of the universe. And so that's kind of what they're doing, and they spend the whole of their time trying to get rid of the kind of like dirty sound and image that keeps coming up, and eventually they get clean sounds and images, which some of the workers in the devs sort of facility disagree with, because they think it's precisely too singular a perspective on things, and that actually there should be a kind of multiplicity of views, and they all basically get killed because of this disagreement, because of the megalomaniacal Forrest's sort of absolute determination effectively to resurrect his daughter, which is a kind of quest for a sort of eternal immortality, a kind of elixir of life. And thinking about Andrea's paper, I mean, I couldn't help but just sort of think about how, you know, the history of quackery and elixirs and sugar as a kind of means of, you know, sugar is a technology for hacking the human, has been historically, was, we've totally changed our diets, our entire systems of taste and consumption have shifted as a result of the kind of mass industrial innovation of this one product, as well as coffee, as well as tobacco, and all these things. I mean, for me, in some senses, there's nothing but the history of biohacking. If you look at the history of BIOS, evolution itself could, from a certain perspective, only be understood as that. So, you know, it's just how the show basically decides that the only way that it can visualize this is by effectively having them sit down in a small movie theater and watch moments from history, as if that were the only way of experiencing it. Of course, this could be an algorithm that's set to convert the actual information into a kind of cinematic reality, but it's also one that then the programmers mistake for reality, and therefore that's my kind of gripe with them not having any critical nous, as it were. What would it look like to look at it from the kind of quantum level? I mean, from my perspective as a theorist, this would be non-cinematic, as it were. I don't think film as a technology is capable of achieving such a kind of thing. I think film has lots of potential, but whether it could show us, whether a human could make machine show us things from the quantum perspective. I don't know whether the quantum, perhaps, I don't know, maybe the quantum perspective is showing us things from its perspective at all times, we're just incapable of understanding it. I'm kind of rambling, but hopefully that's kind of fostering some churning of thought that might allow us to make some further thoughts.
I find that interesting because it sort of, well, it falls into the old trap to think that everything has perspectives, right? Does the quantum have a perspective at all? Is there anything there? Only what we hypothesize and anthropomorphize. That was one of the things that you indicated. And I think I would say, like information doesn't exist unless someone speaks it, right? There's nothing there unless this is why almost all information is racially biased. Almost all information, or probably all information, is inherently, because of its ontogenesis, racially biased. But in implementation, it might lose some of that sometimes. Yeah, I don't think you can say, what would a film be from this perspective, because film is inherently, you would perhaps hypothesize it could be differently, but it's a visual medium based on humans, right? It's like games. Games can't be, like computer games are inherently human things. Even if they're put in another perspective, that perspective is created as human. And it's when you try and force things that are like, it's not even, information isn't even an other. Quantum isn't even an other. It's a non-existent until it exists, and we label it and we describe it. That's what I was trying to say. So, Julia. Oh.
No. Is there a comment in the chat?
No, I thought Andrew was going to say something.
Okay. Does anybody want to go and address what William just went and said, what Jeremy just said? Otherwise, I'm going to slightly guide to a somewhat different direction, if that's all right. Is that okay? All right. No, one of the things that I was just thinking about we are starting to get around to that, especially with Teresa's, Dr. Heffernan's presentation, is that especially with our anthropocentrism, the idea, and then also too with Andrea, with this insistence of post, and what does it mean to have post, and can this actually end up being a material reality or something that can actually be enacted, or does it just end up going and being, in a sense, the same type of human-centric fantasy, right, that we can, in a sense, argue or think our way out of humanism? And one of the things, especially with Dr. Heffernan bringing up the discussion of robot rights, the whole point of rights too, though, is that there needs to be somebody who has the rights to then go and grant rights to somebody else, right? They're inherently human-centric. And I think that's one of the things that we often forget, even with the idea of, if a machine's going to go and create film, in the end, it's going to be understood by the visual language of either the human body, or the knowledge will then go and be placed into that machine by a human. We sort of can't really go and argue our way out of ourselves or even displace ourselves even with technology. And that's just sort of more of a rambly thought, less than a question, but that's one of the things that stood out to me, right? Is that also, what is this big desire to go and get a human removed? And is that even a possibility, or are we just going to end up going and reascribing the same type of power hierarchies? Because the moment that there is apparently no subject in there, it ends up becoming the neutral male able-bodied subject, right? Doesn't it? Anyways, I will leave you all with that.
I would just say, Julia, I think that's a really good point. One of the things when you look at this, I have more on rights about this, but one of the things that you look at is the way that the robot rights people are using the same language as like animal rights, which has been developing since the 19th century. But when you look at some of the animal rights the way that it comes about is exactly that, like how human is it? You know, like, well, let's look at dolphins. They have a sense of autonomy, you know, they can recognize themselves in the mirror. That means we should extend rights to them. And I was thinking, well, but you know, what about the earthworms that are never going to be like, you know, like us? So yeah, good point.
If humans share 17% of their genes with a daffodil, they share a larger number of their genes with earthworms. I mean, when you say they're never going to be like us, I'm not sure I fully agree. But I mean, I take your point, but I think that there's ways in which we can, you know, rethink our kinships, as it were, in such a way that we don't have to be othering otherness so much. The one thing that I would say perhaps that came up in Julia's sort of really interesting intervention was something that I also was thinking about in relation to Andrea's talk, and this is just that I'm not sure that the human is separable from technology. I get the sense that a lot of Bill's questions are kind of pushing us in this direction as well, because he's constantly asking us to think about the screens and the keyboards and all of these things that we're using in order to have these interactions and to exist sort of generally. You know, 2001 as a film perhaps at least puts forward the hypothesis that, you know, effectively it's technology that makes the human into the human. It's that bone that the ape picks up that they wield as a tool, which is what happens after they've touched the monolith, and which gives them intelligence. Throw the bone up into the air and fast forward however long in time, and you have a space shuttle. And so the bone is the most primitive technology. It's technology that makes the human human. So I wonder to what extent it's possible to sort of divorce. For me, let me put it this way. I think that these are only ever really discussions of power and politics when we're trying to work out which technologies are the technologies that are rightfully human and which ones are not, and so on. And that is, you know, that means, well, lots of kind of discussions. I don't know. But similarly, you know, I think that the human is a computer. The human, the kind of, we work by algorithms. Language is an algorithm. It quantifies and evaluates things, you know. So again, if language is what sets us apart from animals, let's say, and some people would argue, you know, it's because there is this sort of algorithmic component to that, this computational component to that. You know, the computer is born out of the human imagination because the human imagination simply is trying to repeat itself, and therefore what the human invents will be a repetition of the human with all of its kind of foibles and shortfalls. And that's why there is this kind of racial and gendered and sexualized sort of underpinning to all of these technologies as well, relating to ability, as you've sort of mentioned. Anyway, Andrea also has a hand up.
Yes, that's a really interesting question. I think maybe that's where I have a slightly different perspective, because I do think that those hominids are human before they pick up the bone. I think it's maybe not our technology usage, but our moral capacity that makes us human, which may take it more into the realm of philosophy, but we are the only moral animal as well as the only tool user. Actually, we're not the only tool user either, which would mean that we have to extend humanness to corvids and some crustaceans too, right? If we define it that way. So yeah, so maybe just that's actually a really interesting discussion, going all the way back to that. Is it our technology that defines us as human? But also, Julia, I was thinking about you and the whole mind uploading thing while William was talking about the quantum computing, because I thought that was so interesting. Now I have to go off and see Devs. I haven't seen it yet. It sounded like something I need to see after listening to William's paper. So I'm going to go off and see it. I don't know if I'm not a computer engineer, and I don't know if Devs has any of this kind of solid stuff in it. But as far as I understand, the whole quantum computing thing has to be solved before we can do mind uploading, because we do not have the computing technology without it. And we can't solve the quantum computing problem because we've got this temperature differential between the qubits and their conductors. So it feels to me like the whole promise of quantum computing that some of these post-human constructions are based on is also another bottle of snake oil, because that hasn't been solved yet, and maybe it never will. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there, Julia, because I know you're thinking about mind uploading for your next project.
We should just remember, like, on these things that, these debates, like even mind uploading has been around forever as a concept. You can probably trace that back to about, I'm guessing, 1750. Not uploading it necessarily into a computer, but uploading it outside the body. And you might be able to trace it back farther than that if you go for religious things. But I'm thinking about people like, Teilhard and the noosphere and things like this. Things have been around forever, and the whole metaphor, like we're talking about as mind as computer, I think that one, that came out of cybernetics and has been summarily disproven, but the mind isn't anything like a computer, and it can't be translated into a computer. But that doesn't mean you can't approximate things, right? And that's the question. And then people disagree on that. So we have a question over here, maybe? The whole question about language and I teach a course sometimes called Technology and Society, and we have this big debate in there about what is a technology. And I always ask students the famous question of, if you can ever define what something is, you should probably be able to define something isn't. So always debate what isn't technology for a human, right? And sometimes students will say language isn't a technology, and I say, look how much you use it. Look how much it uses you, right? There's a lot going on with language and sort of the whole, question of the programmability of language in humans and that sort of thing too. That's a whole nother wishful thinking that happened. What is it? Neuro-linguistic programming. Anybody remember that movement back from the early 80s and 90s, where we should be able to make people do things? But yes, there's a lot going on about this sort of cross metaphor, I think, that we have going on between the mind and the computer, the language and the idea, and the way it all fits together to project this future. And I think there is a lot of fraud and misrepresentation because there's a lot of money at stake, right? And I don't think that's going away. Should we return for more questions? I don't know what our actual timeline was supposed to be. I know we're 20 minutes to 6, and that'll put us at 2 hours at 6. So we maybe go to that 20 minutes. Other thoughts, Russ?
Sorry, technology. 6 o'clock is a good mark.
All right. The theories of technology, right, and technology in everyday life is a huge question. It's something that you can teach. I mean, most people exist in a realm of technological determinism. Most people think, yeah, that's correct. In the chat, Teilhard and noosphere. But most people tend to think that technology determines us, and this is one of the big problems when people enact this, even though we have whole disciplines that show that that's not actually the case. We talk about social construction of technology, we talk about actor network theory. My favorite theory of technology is called the mess, and that is impossible to separate the interactions of humans and technology. They are integrated and not divisible. So that doesn't mean humans are defined by technology. It just means they're not separable from technology. And I show this by showing that people in different cultures in different ways have different technologies of the body, right? Technologies of the self from Foucault, all that stuff. And that's an interesting thing to think about when you're thinking about questions of posthumanism, transhumanism, and neo-humanism, if you want to go there. Russell.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, before we run out of time, I was hoping that William, you might be able to just sort of flesh out, unpack that neologism, that symbol you had combining infinity with OOO, object-oriented ontology. What was that all about?
It's kind of a way of, I mean, probably the use of the word ontology is inappropriate in the grand scheme of things, but it's a way of getting into trying to, if it's infinite, then it's a kind of way of just trying to get into, how do I put this? I mean, I guess it's come up, it's a way of conceptualizing nothing, I guess, in the language that Jeremy's kind of brought up here today, you know, outside of the human, there's nothing, things that sort of, they just sort of come into existence, you know, all of any way that we have of trying to define things. Is it a human? Is it technology? Oh no, but the animals do this and the machines do that. You know, all of these sort of categorizations that we're using, effectively all of this language that we're using to pass things, you know, demonstrates, you know, cannot get at reality, whatever that is, should there be anything that lies beyond whatever that means. And I think that what David Fleming and I are trying to do is to kind of signal to that in what we might call a deictic fashion. So I guess one of our issues with certainly like Harman and people like that, maybe less Meyasu, but it is actually in relation to Harman is that Harman doesn't understand time, even though he claims that he is correcting Heidegger on his understanding of time. Getting into that, I'll have to look at some notes, I think, just to make sure that I can explain it properly. But and that there's a kind of continuing emphasis, perhaps on the object as static, which Harman tries to kind of get rid of and sort of say, well, you know, objects aren't static, you know, they're always withdrawing, there's this kind of impossibility about them and so on, but there's a sort of lingering tension there that I don't think quite gets at that which is withdrawn, let's say, and also the way in which that which is withdrawn, you know, is in and of itself caught up in histories of exclusion and so on. So, you know, I've been putting a couple of names in the chat just in the last few posts. Sylvia Winter, I think, as it would be a good example of for me as of a theorist who effectively is kind of pointing out that, you know, ontology, and this is why infinite ontology is perhaps not the greatest title, but we might stick with it for the time being, that, you know, ontology is a social construct. And so, you know, and it's particularly one that was drawn up for the purposes of creating a racialized white Western modernity and used as a system of power. In effect, we decided to invent this idea of reality so that we could relegate into the unreal that which we simply don't want to have to deal with, or which we want to be able to treat in whatever way that we like, effectively immorally, if otherwise it is about the kind of the invention of a sort of boundary between the moral and the immoral. It would be about the invention of an excuse to be morally immoral because it doesn't exist, and therefore you can do what you like to it, which means that you don't actually have within the system itself any moral obligation to it because it doesn't exist. But of course, you know, the Middle Passage is real, it happened, and so that which has been consigned to the outside does have an effect. And, you know, thinking in a kind of quantum physical sort of way about this, the way that effectively light is born from black holes, that which we cannot really quantify because the amount of information that they leak is so sort of infinitesimal. This outside actually is a structuring principle of what we have. So to kind of bring the infinite into contact with the ontological, which would in principle be finite, is a way of trying to get at that sort of contradiction. These outsides are fundamental and entangled with the inside, and that this works both kind of on a, in terms of this kind of racial history that we're talking about, as well as in some senses on this what I would call scientific epistemological level, but that is because these epistemologies of science, black holes and so on, are accurate or not as they may be, as if we could ever know that, nonetheless are born out of the very same system of sort of power and the creation of knowledge as a thing in and of itself that would put in place these divisions that allow for murder effectively. And so, that's kind of what we're trying to get at. Does that make any sense? I feel like I might just be rambling and kind of nonsensical.
No, I that was an incredible answer. So the phrase infinite ontology, that's your title, right? So far, it is kind of a response to Heidegger's being in time in a way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know how much we look. I mean, the book as it's currently structured in the proposal is about 8 shows. It's a kind of follow-up to this book that Fleming and I did on squids and cinemas and octopuses and stuff. And at the end of that, we sort of come in sort of quite hard arguing about this sort of racial. Effectively, we engage with Rocco's basilisk. I don't know if people know what Roscoe's basilisk is, but it's effectively the idea that there's a supercomputer that is so powerful that it is God, and if you don't effectively worship the supercomputer now, then what will happen is when it comes into being, it will know that you didn't want it to come into being, and it will put you in a hell of your own division. So it's called the most dangerous thought experiment of all time, and it's kind of fun, but harrowing for some people. But we basically argue that these machines will only have the same biases as their inventors, and actually our view is that we have to have an ethical relationship with our machines in order for them not to be murderers, basically, and not that we will necessarily be successful in that, but hey, maybe you've got to try. So we kind of want to extend that, and we're doing that through the consideration of Lovecraft Country, the OA, Watchmen, and a bunch of shows basically that still continue with the same cephalopodic logic that's there in a lot of these shows. There's an octopus in most of those shows at some point, or squids, but which are very much also focused on a kind of techno-racial reality or present or imagined future, and so using that as a way of getting in there. So in that Squid Cinema book that David and I have already written, we do, I think it's only in a footnote, but we basically do this kind of thing with Heidegger and Hamann, and I don't necessarily, we could expand upon it, but I don't think we sort of necessarily, it's there, but not necessarily explicitly. And just so you know, this was a piece that I have solely written so far. David and I are yet to bring together our writings, just in case. So I'm not presenting as my own work of 2 people today. It will become the work of 2 people in time.
Thank you.
It strikes me to some extent that one of the interesting things about ontology is the one subfield. I mean, the general field is interesting, but I love mereology, which is the study of relations in sets, which is the problem of mereology. The biggest problem is that everything can be contained in one set, including that which can't be contained in that set. So it's always self-contradicting, and thus everything is true. But it is also necessary to understand the relationships of sets and subsets and the relations of sets. And that is nearly infinite. So when you initially said infinite ontology, I said, well, that's like a mereology study. It's like thinking about all the sets of everything that's related and how they're related. And that's actually one of the failures, I think, of object-oriented ontology in general, is that it doesn't deal with mereology very well. It deals with sort of flattening the mereology and denying the existence of certain elements of difference, which are very important to humans, which also happens in, some people say it happens in actor network theory. I don't think it does, but it can, right? Anybody can do anything with any theory and make it operationalized in almost any negative way you want, which is an interesting thing about most theories. You know, every liberation can be an oppressive regime. So that's always a problem. So we have 5 more minutes. I think, you know, I don't know if anybody else wants to summarize. I'll take my brief privilege in thanking everyone for showing up. Yes, William?
Sorry, Jerry, I'm just just a very brief response to what you just said, which I think was great. Within kind of film studies, I think that one way it doesn't get put this way, although maybe it's kind of in there somewhere. Laura Marks is sort of a foundational figure in one of the foundational figures with Vivian Sobchak and a few others in kind of bringing phenomenology into film studies. And even if we don't consider phenomenology easily to sit with the idea of mereology as you're describing it, it is kind of about relations, and this sort of phenomenological understanding of film and media is effectively a way of trying to get away from the merely audiovisual components of film, these sort of distal senses, and to think about proximity and sort of physical engagement, in effect to think about film as an experience relationally. And perhaps it's no coincidence that Marx in particular kind of heads to the Middle East in her wider work and starts to think of Al-Khwarizmis, the philosopher who is responsible for algorithms, for example, you know, in a way to sort of question both this kind of Western ocular-centric kind of vision of things and so on. So I think even if we as kind of film scholars are not thinking in this way and haven't made reference to that, I think that there's a sense of that at work, because this is, in my kind of own language, kind of trying to think about the kind of the non-cinematic effectively. If cinema especially as it's become the kind of, I'm going to call it the dominant ethos of our world, which might sound silly in the age of social media, but you know, this emphasis has been very elaborately and successfully highlighted here by both of Teresa and Andrea, you know, of this emphasis on the visual, this emphasis on kind of like being seen and as existence, because of, you know, if you're not on social media, who are you, and thirsty images and all this kind of stuff. Effectively, you know, this is looking for a different mode of knowledge in some senses. So yeah, just that was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, that strikes the chord of modes of knowledge from, you know, what's his name? Also the person who created Alfred Lorden Whitehead, Process Relational Philosophy, right? And Modes of Knowledge are 2 of his books, which came out about the same time or a little after Phenomenology in France, as I understand, or at least like he came out in the 50s and they came out in the 60s, what I've read, Husserl and that type of thing. But I am not a film studies scholar. I have little to no exposure to that field, and I not that I have no interest, but I just haven't never taught in that field. I've taught in 7 other fields though, which is to my detriment, I think. But anyway, we have a few minutes to summarize. And I think we've covered a lot of interesting topics today.
Jeremy, sorry, I think Teresa was going to say something.
Yeah.
Maybe.
No.
Oh, sorry.
But I was just going to ask for any final comments from everybody, and then turn it over to probably Julia. Any final comments from anybody?
Sorry, I will say one last thing. I was really registered, both Andrea and I think Will brought this up, and it's something that that I've just been so aware of the way that a lot of the technology industry reads fiction in such a literal manner, in such a problematic manner, as if it is some sort of guide to the future, or as Jill Lepore said, as a user's manual. And I think that there's something that, I think that that's where we really need to kind of take apart that collapse of fiction and science and really sort of try to pull that apart a bit.
I so agree with you, Teresa. I did my undergrad in double majoring in biochemistry and physics, and I left the sciences and came into the arts because I felt they were not answering the right questions. They were missing the message of the stories. They just wanted to know what they could do, what they could bring into being. They were missing the whole point of what the story was trying to tell us. So yeah, it's a great point, Teresa, really great.
Any other final comments? I'll turn it over to Julia therefore, because this is her panel.
But you did such an amazing job hosting for us, Jeremy. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming to listen. Thank you to our panelists once again for some amazing presentations. A lot to think about. I think I have, William, you've annihilated my bank account in terms of books I need to buy or legally download at one point or another. So thank you for that. And thank you everybody for your interest, but also thank you to Russ Kilbourne for really spearheading this entire series of panels and for giving so much faith and trust into your PhD students too, to really go and, when I said that this would be something I'd be interested in doing, you were very encouraging. So thank you so much. And just as a reminder, this will be the recording of this panel will be uploaded to the Posthumanist Research Institute's YouTube channel. You can also find the previous panel from this series also uploaded there. And again, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.